And this is your third appearance, I
Yeah,
believe.
it
That's
is.
something of a record for Frankenstein Chat.
Is
I
it?
think there, yeah, I think there is only one other guest who's appeared three times on the show.
Is
So,
that Mike?
yes.
Mike
So,
Rotherham.
Who I've appeared with.
yeah. So congratulations on matching Mike. But anyway, thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Before we'll go to Stan, and then we'll allow you a chance to introduce yourself to those who've not met you before. So, how are you, Stan?
Okay, apart from having a bad back, which is a long-term thing, but I've done something, twisted it, or put me back to square one now, so I'm not sleeping well at the moment.
Oh, it's that bad.
Yeah, it's one of those where you turn over and it wakes you up.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, Lucy, do you want to do a little intro, who you are and sort of stuff you get up to and how you know Stan?
Yes, so I'm Lucy Trueman. I'm the Managing Director of TruemanChange. We're a small management consultancy based in the Northwest, and we specialise in helping public sector organisations to do change well and really make a difference. But also, as well as that, I'm currently stepping back a little bit from that because I'm a full-time student at the University of Birkbeck doing a master's in organisational psychology, which is putting me in a really lovely geeky headspace of instead of running around and rushing and running a business, I'm now getting to really think about stuff, which feels like a very happy luxury. But I've known Stan for a number of years, so we used to work together. Stan was my manager, I don't even know how many years ago. I mean, I've had TruemanChange 9 years, so it
2006, I think it was.
Oh gosh.
So I worked for Stan for 5 years in a traded service in Lancashire Council, where I was the sort of cold-hearted person that didn't like children, helping to turn an education service into a profit-making service. So we had lots of professional tension, I would say.
Surplus making. We weren't allowed to make a profit, but we could make a
Well, that's a true cooperative business. They don't talk about profit. Lucy, I'm interested in why a master's degree now, when in fact the business, in a sense, business, I suspect the sort of public sector are going through significant change, and that must put a great deal of demand on your time and your business. So why now?
I think COVID was a real reset for me, and the thing that I found. So, as you know, I've spoken on previous podcasts. I lost my dad to COVID right at the start of the pandemic, and then really had time because of everything going on hold. All sorts of established change programs went on hold during the pandemic for our clients. So I had quite a significant amount of headspace at that time to really think about why public sector organizations were able to make change happen so quickly as a result of COVID, whereas traditionally, using the whole project and change management methodology didn't, it was normal to have a 4-year transformation program that didn't really come to anything. So I think that put me in quite an academic, geeky headspace of really thinking about and understanding. And then as a result of that work, we then won quite a lot of work because people were really interested in this. Let's think about doing change differently going forward after COVID. So the business has grown quite a lot in the last 18 months, 2 years. Got a really good established team now. And I just feel like I want to continue that intellectual challenge of, well, how do you actually do this really well? So it just felt like the right time. The business is doing well enough for me to step back. And I enjoy being in that kind of thoughtful space. I feel very privileged to be able to do it at this point in my career.
Yeah, I mean, not declaring who these groups or organizations are, but is there a sort of sense that the pandemic and all that was happening, particularly around, say, health, social care, education, where it was very rapid, there was probably very, very little structure, but sort of just doing things on the hoof. Is there has that reset enough and has that sort of embedded itself enough for it to
No.
be for its community, or have people simply just reverted back to the way they used to do it before?
I would say it's a mix. So some are kind of reverting. I wouldn't say fully reverted back. The challenge in local government, which is where a lot of our work is that it's a very highly regulated sector, and there were legal changes during the pandemic that allowed the shedding of some of that bureaucracy and some of that governance and the things that tend to slow things down, which now have been reinstated again. So it's not possible to do things exactly how they were done during the pandemic. What has stayed is that understanding of how important partnership working is. So we're doing different types of work with different organizations, but we're doing a lot of work around community co-design. We're doing a lot of work in partnership spaces. And what I've noticed is, 4 years ago when we were doing work in partnership spaces, people were getting stuck in conversations of, well, what budget is this coming from? Whereas now there is more of just a better quality of relationship where people are trying to get to better outcomes. But there is a default back to that comfort zone, and some of the bureaucracy and change is not because of the legislation, it's because of comfort zones, it's because of culture, and it's because it's scary making decisions, and it's scary making decisions around change. It's safer to keep things as they are. But I'm really positive about it. And I do see an increase in more genuine, authentic, human-based conversations. But it is mixed, and you do see across different organisations, some are very quick to revert back, whereas some are really fighting the urge to. But it's just such a unique point in time. And I've noticed even in my masters, a lot of the stuff that I'm reading about is still like 3 or 4 years old, and actually normally that's not that old, but at this point in time 3 or 4 years old feels like a century ago. So it's a very exciting time, I think, to be really critically looking at leadership and leadership of change. So yeah, I wanted to just devote the time to it, and I was going to do it part-time, but then I thought it'll become a chore, you'll be fitting it in around work. If you flip that, then it will become the priority. It's not working right now, and I'm always behind in reading.
Did you have much choice at Birkbeck? Did you actually shop around, or was there a connection with Birkbeck?
I did shop around. The connection with Birkbeck for me was that they seem very well set up for older students that are juggling work. It's done predominantly remotely, but I go to London for weekends every few weeks, so you still get some face-to-face element. I love London as a city. I'm always happy to spend time there. And they are very well respected in terms of organizational psychology specifically. So yeah, it seemed like a good fit. One of the first modules I'm doing is on organizational change. And I did think this is either going to be really awesome or really awful. And it's been brilliant. I've really enjoyed it. It's really validated a lot of my instincts that I've always had, that the change management methodologies that we use are not really as effective as we like to think they are. So yeah, it's quite rich, the material that I'm reading, which is lovely.
Right.
Well, I think you're back on the, if it doesn't change the culture, it doesn't actually change anything. People just I think I said this either last week or the week before, there's passive resistance to change, and you just sit it out, and knowing that eventually they'll give up. If I just sit quietly, keep my head down, we'll get back to the way we've always
done. Yeah, it will go.
And it works.
Because the way we've always done things has always worked for me. That's the difficult one to shift.
Yeah.
I think it was interesting. We had a guest, Kevin Turner, who's the artistic director of Company Chameleon, a contemporary dance company, a young man, sort of probably in his early 30s. But he spoke about having set up a new dance setup in, I think it was Harper Hay, but an area of Manchester. And he said that he felt as though it was strong enough, the culture had developed sufficiently for him not to have to be there in order to maintain it, and he was then offline when I spoke to him. He was saying how that's a little bit scary at times as well, because then you're testing always as to whether or not how well embedded is it, and actually how quickly will it fall away, But of course you've got to leave it a little while each time, leaving it a little bit longer to see how far it will stand, and then actually be able to step in and do something about it.
And Frank, there's always that little bit in the back of your head that says, I hope it doesn't run perfectly, because surely they need me.
But actually, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because we're going to do this in a slightly different order here, because
Go on.
well, I know that you mentioning before, though, Lucy, about your sort of masters, and about, you know, that you're doing some work on leadership,
Yeah.
and it's made you think quite carefully about that leadership and who provides it. Do you want to sort of cover that now? Because it seems a good time, as it's part of the discussion, to bring you in on that.
Yeah, so I've been reading only in the last couple of days a very critical view of the concept of leadership, and how in recent years we've developed this concept of leadership that's very, very fundamentally based around individual characters. So at an academic level, people have studied what traits leaders have, but even in like the media, we all know who the big famous sort of Richard Branson, Elon Musk, and we've created this almost hero complex. And you see it in organizations where when they're in trouble, they get a new leader in, or a new chief executive, and that person is going to lead us out of this trouble. And the research now is trying to focus a bit more on, is it really about a body? Is it about a person and their attributes and skills? Or is it much more socially constructed and much more contextual than that? And actually maybe made up of more than one person, a few people, but also is made up of things that aren't people. So one example in a paper I read recently, I can't remember which company it was, it might have been IBM, but that sort of big, massive company, and the leader or chief exec turned up at a site, and this part-time security guard who was in her second week of the job refused to let him in because he had the wrong colour badge. And there was this big, do you know who this person is? And she was like, but he's not got the right colour badge. And he was fine and was like, we'll get the right colour badge. But that's an example of how it was an inanimate object that in that particular situation held great power. And there's something about looking at a web. So there's a theory called actor network theory, which is where you are looking at a combination of these inanimate objects, people, relationships, groups, stakeholders, and you almost draw a map of how things get done in an organization, which really aligns with some of the culture mapping work that we do in my business, and that I know Stan is a big fan of, where you go into organizations and look at the habits and the rituals and the symbols. So it feels like that is it's much more difficult to study, because wouldn't it be nicer to be able to
a few traits,
yeah, they've all got these traits, and we can train people in these things. So it's much more difficult to kind of get your hands on, but it feels much more intuitively right to me. And not only does it feel right, there's a danger to this hero complex. And sometimes somebody can be a very good leader in that they take an organization into a direction very strongly, but actually it was the wrong thing to do, and it was about that person. I read a quote recently about transformational leadership, which a lot of people really love, saying, was Hitler a transformational leader? Did he lead big groups of people into something and actually do a good job of leading them into something? So this whole thing of attaching it to one person can, in some circumstances, be incredibly toxic. And I think as leaders in organizations, so I'm obviously straddling this world of academia, but also consultancy and helping organizations, you've really got to think about, do you really want to pin your hopes on one individual, or do we need to look at this kind of mapping of where is leadership actually a space, not a person? And that's kind of what's on my mind today. If you speak to me next week, it'll be something entirely different.
Education have jumped on that in the past, and we've had superheads who have successfully run one school, and therefore will be able to be dropped into school B and sort it all out because they've done it before. I can't recall anything that happened that worked in that model. Now, they may have done okay, but there was certainly nothing that said this is the working model, we'll move it forward. And yet every now and again we seem to be moving back towards that there are these super head teachers who can just make schools work really well, and it misses the fact that it's about a culture. And maybe there are people who can define a culture and create a culture, But actually, the leadership then comes from within. And I was saying before we went on there, you have to find out where the leadership lies in an organization, and it doesn't have to be with the most senior person. And I somebody I work with now, I can remember her as a very, very effective deputy running a school that was running really well, despite the leader at the top.
Yeah, it's very interesting because this morning I did a briefing for some CEOs of some multi-academy trusts on summary evaluations that have been undertaken by Ofsted. About 5, they've only done 5 of these trusts, these evaluations. But there is a sort of, when you read the reports, you can get a feel for the expectation that the CEO is the one who creates the sort of, the approach to behavior is driven by what they pick up on when they go and visit a school. So in a sense, they're saying that these responsibilities cannot be delegated. And I stress that, only not that I believe it, but actually that's what the thinking is, within the way that these reports are written. And in a way, I go back to the very first inspection. I remember a small school in Cheshire. Speaking to the head teacher, got a fantastic grade, and he said, I said, well, how did you do it? He said, I never forgot the fact. He said, I'm not the greatest leader. I don't do professional development particularly well, but I'm a bloody good maths teacher, and I've never forgotten that. And he said, in a small school like ours, I can have a massive impact on a lot of children by teaching them really well. And it sort of really struck me about, hang on a minute, there's a different way of looking at this. This isn't about a policy, is it? Or about, doing a good staff meeting or whatever. There's something a bit deeper, a bit richer in that sort of, that leadership title that works for some, that might not work for others.
Well, you could argue that the role of a successful leader is creating that network and creating that culture where people feel that they can. I mean, the research that underpins the work we've done with Spotlight and with Mike and Mark is all about everybody contributing, everyone feeling that they can contribute without being judged, and you've got to facilitate that. It doesn't just happen. And it's not a case of just sitting there around a table and say, well, you can all say what you think. It's about whether they're valued.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of places I've visited where senior people didn't have that value that they placed on people lower down the organisation. And even when Lucy and I worked together, there was a sort of rift between a level that was paid higher than a lower level, and the treatment between the two wasn't pleasant.
Do you think though that how long does it take to work out, either through talking to a senior leader or actually visiting a business or an institution? How long does it take to get a feel for, that sort of the complexity of that leadership, that actually this is about that person, the way that they speak, the way that they project themselves, the way that their, those ideas are promoted, as opposed to those where it's a sort of slightly more, I wouldn't say delegated, but it's a more collegiate sort of approach. How long does it take to work that out?
I personally don't think it takes very long.
No, right.
I don't know if I'm naive in that, but
I'm glad you've said that, Lucy, because I was thinking, well, if you're going to say it takes weeks, and I'm thinking you can walk into a place.
Well, I asked the question because I know what I think the answer is for me anyway. But anyway, go on.
We do something called culture mapping as an organisation, where we go in, we'll run, maybe half a dozen workshops, and this is for organisations that are pretty big, with staff, where we walk through different elements of culture, and we very quickly can produce a very in-depth report that says this is where your blockers are. But the other thing that I've been reflecting on as a result of this is, we spend a lot of time and energy talking about the difference between leadership and management. And if what we're saying is leadership is in fact a network of different objects and people, then is that definition of leadership versus management actually helpful? Because a lot of elements of leadership, if you look at it through that lens that it's a network, will be how things are managed. What security badges, what color is how things are managed. And I think that there's something about that distinction that, again, creates a little bit, we can say all we want that both are important, but it somehow creates a little bit of a hierarchy that leadership is sexier.
That's exactly it, Lucy. And that's what's
I
happened
think
over the last 10, 15 years, that leadership is now the thing. If you look in education, if you look at courses, CPD for people who are aspiring to be head teachers, it's all leadership. Try and find a course on management, not sexy enough. And yet leaders and managers, in my view, are the same people.
Yeah.
They have to have both skill sets. Some are not good at one and better at the other. And then again, my view then is you find people to work with you who've got strengths where you've got weaknesses.
Yeah.
Because that's the only way you work together as a group.
I heard a CEO this week, and I visited their head office, and there was a complete alignment between the culture that I went into their offices first, and I met this person just by chance, and I was really struck by how at ease she was and how others were at ease in her company, and it was a genuine sort of desire to learn more from her staff, to better understand not just them as an individual, but the difficulties they're facing. And actually there was a real sense of they felt open, and this actual structure of the building was great. It was a digital business. It was all very much quite relaxed, but you could a real sense of effort in the building. Hearing her this week, it just aligned, the way she expressed, what that company is trying to achieve and how it's doing it with its staff. There was no falseness about it. This was reality. This is sort of like her as a human being, how she best performs. And actually she's trying to sort of like enable to surround herself with other people that in effect see it that way, because actually I do think there's a struggle here for those who perhaps do have a slightly different approach to what leadership is, and there's I got a feeling a little bit about selecting people that you knew would fit into that culture. I was really struck by it this week. She was amazing.
It's about talent spotting, and I mean, I think when I've been in organizations where I've been successfully leading, it's been about spotting the people who are going to make things work and who think maybe in the same way that I think, but often somebody who thinks very differently, somebody who brings a bit of challenge into it, somebody who maybe you don't really like. And bring.
Is that what I was, Stan? What? Is that what I was?
I think you were only temporary when you came.
Yeah, it was a 3-month contract when I started.
3-month contract.
5 years I was there.
So why did you take the job, Lucy?
Honestly, working
you
for
should be asking me why I got the job. And that was, I'll tell you what that was, because I had something like 2 weeks of every day. Are you going to give me this job?
Oh, really?
That was the permanent bit. The original temporary bit, honestly, I did not know what I wanted to do. So I was talking about this night before last, actually, with a recruiter. I left a job in the police because I couldn't really see a career structure there. And I took a job in a recruitment agency, and I quit on my second day because they told me that I had to wear tights. And I was just like, I'm not working anywhere that tells me what I have to wear. So I walked out and then didn't know what I wanted. So saw a temporary 3-month job applied at the advertised at the local council. But you know what? I don't think I've ever told you this, Stan, but I found out after my dad had died from my uncle, a story that my dad had never told me, that he once quit a job in his first week because somebody told him he had to wear a tie. So it's clearly a hereditary attitude problem that I have.
Stan, you were what's caught your eye this week is very much along that, isn't it?
It's
not about wearing ties, but
it's a little bit of research that's been done by Impact Ed on well-being and looking at what people would expect maybe well-being in schools for staff, which would be about shorter hours and lower workloads and things. And whereas they are important, what they found out is the greatest correlation is where leadership and management is respected. So, it's about, I would say straight away, it's about culture, wouldn't I? But it's about being valued and valuing the leadership that's in the school, and that then being happy in my work, it makes a bigger difference than cutting my workload by a little bit, or giving me a day off a year to go Christmas shopping, or buying chocolates for the staff room. I mean,
is
you do
that
all those as well.
An interesting challenge to that is that real, that leadership and would make a difference, or does that prove the point that we've just argued, that this kind of hero complex is so embedded in our culture professionally that people are feeling that they need that hero, and actually if they turned inwards and thought, no, regardless of who's at the top, we can create a better school, we can create a better working environment.
I suppose it
depends
how those people who are asked what makes this work for you, if they say it's the leadership, they might not be talking about a hero leader. They might be talking about how we all work together. What gets me about leadership, and I've had this conversation before, especially in education, when Frank and I did our first inspections a long time ago,
1995.
Leadership wasn't leadership was only in the whole framework, which is a massive tome, once, and it was about the governors. Did the governors provide strategic leadership? The aspect for head teachers came under the heading of management and administration. The administration's never mentioned now, is it?
No. Well, like finance, that's never mentioned, but that's another story. But the thing is also...
But leadership group, this is a personal view, I have no evidence at all, but what they found out is in schools that had good results, they said, it's a good school, it must have good leader. So leadership scored highly in schools that were good. And then, believing their own data, they started to say, well, if leadership's good, then the school must be good. So it's leadership that we need to develop, and it's these leaders. Not, let's really look at what's making successful schools work. And in some cases, they are figurehead. There are figurehead leaders, but it's how they manage and develop and work with the other people in the team or in the school.
It's quite interesting, though, isn't it, about if you have a leader that is sort of creates a sort of leadership approach similar to what you described, Lucy, which is it's much more complex. It's some of it's based on sort of patronage, even, but actually for a board looking for a new leader, they really do need to understand, don't they, what type of leadership they've got now, because actually that's starting to challenge them, or probably they need to challenge themselves as to, well, what's our understanding of what leadership is, because if not, you could be, in effect, ditching a lot of fantastic stuff simply because you've got a very narrow view of what leadership is.
I think you can relate that to where's, I said before, you need to find out where the leadership lies. You also need to find out where the culture lies, the culture drivers. So if you're in a school that's not operating very well, you need to find out where the cliques in the school, the cliques in the organization that are retaining a culture that suits them, even though it damages the organization as a whole. And you need to find that and fix it or walk away from it. It's very hard to change. I can think of a number of what you would describe as really good head teachers going into schools that needed change and being unable to do it because the culture was such that we've seen them come and go. That approach.
I do think that it is. in answer, going back to your question, can you figure it out pretty quickly? I think you can figure it out pretty quickly, with the caveat of if you know what you're looking for. And
Oh, yeah.
interestingly, I do sometimes say in organizations when I'm running workshops and so on, and I'm asking them to describe the organization, I actually forbid them for using the words which we're using now, because when people describe we need more leadership, they mean something that they don't really necessarily quantify, and it's up here. And often when people are saying that the culture needs to change, again, they don't really know what they mean. They mean something over here. They never mean anything here. So I think it's about having, and whatever, we use one by somebody called Taylor. I know Edgar Schein has done one. There's loads of different versions of culture mapping, but really understanding what you're looking for enables you to identify those blockers. And that's a big part of the work for us, is what in your culture is actually holding back change. And sometimes it's something really ridiculous. So we had a council where they wanted to make sure that their staff, their managers and leaders, were more agile and less sort of, empire building. And it turned out that in their job sort of I've forgotten what they call it, a job evaluation process where they score your job, the more staff you manage, the more you got paid. So something that's really quite small and innocuous and is just a policy decision is driving, and it's a big driver, this behavior of I must get a bigger team, and yet you're saying you want them to not behave that way. So sometimes it's something really sort of things that are overlooked because they're so embedded in an organization. But I am conscious, and I did just want to make the point that we can all talk about leadership and culture, but it is getting that clarity and almost doing it through a much more practical language. So, asking questions like what systems get in the way is a better question than asking what's your culture like, because people don't know what that means.
Do you find that they also revert back to individuals as opposed to systems? The system's fine, but it's actually him or her that's the problem. That's also quite a simple sort of approach to it, though, isn't it? It's sort of like, get rid of that blockage and then suddenly everything's going to be fine, which it very rarely is, you know what I mean?
And systems are systems. I always find it's never the system that's at fault. It's the people who are managing the system where the fault lies. I mean, it's most systems are developed to be efficient. And the thing that stop it are the people who don't want it to work in the way that it does work, because for personal or gain or advantage.
Well, it's interesting. Before, you were mentioning the word leadership and trying to do work that you're not, where you're not allowed to use that word. So you've got to sort of find a different sort of narrative around it. But this week I attended the Great Northern Conference at UA 92, and I'd recommend anybody watching this if you get a chance, to go and see UA 92, the new university right next to Lancashire Cricket Ground, which is actually focusing in on young people who probably wouldn't normally go to university. So these students are getting their travel to the site. They're not on a fixed timetable, so they can actually, the timetables are set up so that they can actually work. So, there's a lot of flexibility. Interestingly, they do everything on a modular basis, which, bearing in mind where we've been, Stan, with GCSEs and A levels, where you've all got to sit in a room. But what was most refreshing was the whole morning we had senior business leaders, all of them freely using the word skills. And for Stan and I in education, skills has become a bit of a dirty word. And something that you're not really allowed to use. And in effect, it's become education and skills, as if skills is not part of a decent education. It's a sort of tagged on at the end of education, something that happens when you've done your GCSEs or you've done your A levels, then we'll start addressing the skills.
If you can't learn the subject, maybe you'll have some skills that you can use elsewhere. If you don't manage the academic side. But
here we've got major businesses, international businesses, CEOs of those businesses, crying out for a more mature dialogue with education leaders, not with government, but with education leaders. Because actually, I think there is a sort of narrative here where actually the government feels a little bit closed in on this argument. But actually, when I was listening to it, there was only one head teacher in the room of about 300, or everybody else was from a business background. But oh gosh, if only the head teachers had been in the room to hear what change is needed in order to deliver a growing economy for the UK. It was there, and I think it's a feeling that head teachers have got I'm not sure they've got the capacity, but they have got they've got encouragement from business to do things differently. If only they could get a sense of that, I think they feel closed in by government, closed in by regulation, closed in by inspection, closed in by assessment, that the things that need to happen are not happening, and the impact is business is suffering,
Yeah,
so
I mean, well, speaking as a business owner, I would definitely echo that. And, to me, I don't want to sound derogatory, but knowledge is cheap. It's so fast to get knowledge. It's so easy to get it. It's accessible. I would absolutely prioritize somebody's values, their attitude, their skills, their ability to learn quickly, far over I have a qualification in project management, far over. And I have seen in lots of situations people with knowledge of how to do change and actually crash and burn when they hit the ground.
No disrespect to here's a woman studying a master's,
Yeah, and I'm
actually
loving it. It feels like
it means nothing, does it? It's
No.
not going to make in itself is not going to make your business better. It will have an impact on you. It's how you use that, isn't it?
Yeah.
In your business setting.
Yeah.
It just made me think, Frank, and Lucy with saying all that about collecting knowledge. This is a story from a long time ago when CPD was free and teachers went out. And I remember recruiting and seeing this teacher's CV, which was absolutely stunning, the number of courses and studies they'd done. And I rang the head to say, well, this is a fantastic CV. And he said, yeah, I have to be honest with you. It's because we get him out of the school as often as we can. Because it's absolutely hopeless.
Okay, well, believe it or not, we're nearly at 40 minutes and we generally only do about 35. But should we get on to room 101? What are you going to put in room 101, Lucy?
I'm going to put into room 101 overly simplistic change management models, because I've always hated them. And I was really nervous about the change management module in my master's, and it turns out that actually academically people hate them too, and so that was very validating. But there is a lot, and I won't name names. You'll all have heard of particular change management methodology where there's a number of steps, there's different numbers of steps with different ones. And I'm guilty of this. I've trained people in them. But I think that there's something about it where it is basically all about control rather than change. It is methodologies where it enables leaders and managers to feel a sense of control over a process that's fundamentally not real. Change really happens when people want to make change happen, and it doesn't happen in a perfect order.
Does that, when you throw in that in room 101, does that graph go in that I hate? Is that part of it?
Yeah.
Which is the graph?
Well, it's not really a graph. It's a diagram they put on the change thing where you go through all these various things. You come up the other side, and one, I've never seen anybody at that. I've never seen get to that point. But if you did, the people that they must ask to survey are the ones that have been through it successfully. So they're bound to be smiling. But whenever somebody's put that on, I've always said, so what does that represent? And they never know, because it just sounds right that you go into this, feeling of threatened. Then you feel as though you can't affect anything. Then you feel as though then suddenly you become enthusiastic about it again, and you end up on the other side.
So in fairness, the studies that all that was based on a study around people being told they were going to die.
Yeah, I know.
It was not to do with
no
organizational change at all. And it's been adopted by the community, and it's been adopted for the reasons that I said, that it gives a sense of control. Because if you believe people are going to go through that, then when somebody is resisting the change, you can just tell yourself, well, they're there on the graph, so I can ignore that.
Yeah.
Now, I do think there's legitimacy in that people have an emotional response to change, and people vary in their degrees of how stressful they find it. But overly simplistic tools like that applied badly do so much damage, I think.
Well, I have to say, even if nobody watches this video, I have to say, and we're really lucky to have some great guests on here, aren't we, Stan? But
Yeah, we are.
that whole 40 minutes has been a great 40 minutes for my week this week.
Oh, it has me.
It really has.
What you should do, Frank, is read. I just happen to have it here.
He always gets this out. And can I just tell you, they cover this on this Masters. So that's why I think
battered.
you would love
Look how battered
that is. Stan, that could be my Christmas present if you were thinking of getting me one.
You should see how much it costs, Frank.
Can you get it on Kindle?
40 quid, I think, for a copy. You've had that.
But it's been brilliant. Again, Lucius, thank you so much. And obviously, if anybody's watching this who wants to know more about Lucy's work, there's a website there, isn't there?
Yeah, truemanchange.co.uk.
Yeah.
We've got a really good tool on it, actually, which you can just go in, answer a few questions about your organisation. It will kick out a PDF report that will give you some scoring on how ready for change you are and some help and advice on what you might want to consider. But yeah, do feel free to get in touch. It won't be me because I'm a student. I've retired now. One of my team will help.
It's like Shirley Valentine.
Anyway, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Lucy. And no doubt we'll have you on again as a guest in 2023 to beat Mike, to be the first person.
Oh, bring him too. We'll do a joint one again.
All right. Yeah, okay. Anyway, thank you, Stan, as well.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Lucy.
All being well, we'll see everybody next week. And thank you for watching and for listening.